The birth of blood, from funeral rite to spectacle. The Forum Boarium smelled of damp stone and cattle dung. Beneath its open sky, 3 pairs of armoured men stepped into a makeshift arena. They were not soldiers, they were slaves' bodies borrowed from death to honour death. The year was 264 BC and Decimus Junius Brutus Scaever had just buried his father. To mark the passing, he ordered a munus, a duty in which men would bleed for the spirit of the deceased. What Livy later called the first gladiatorial combat in Rome began not with applause, but with silence. The crowd watched as iron struck flesh, as blood darkened the dust, and as the soul of the dead was believed to drink strength from sacrifice. At its birth, gladiatorial combat was not sport. It was communion, the living offering their mortality to the shadows that lingered around tombs. The ritual came to Rome from the south, from Campania, where the Samnites and Oscans had long performed duels beside the graves of their ancestors. Their death was not an ending, but a negotiation. The fallen demanded repayment in kind. The blood of captives or slaves became the coin. Etruscan funerary art shows the same grim courtesy wrestlers and duelists painted beside banqueting ghosts, the living, proving they remembered. Across the Mediterranean, from Homeric Greece to Carthaginian shrines, death had always required gesture. Rome's genius was not invention, it was appropriation. As the Republic grew, so too did the appetite for spectacle. What had once been private mourning began to invite witnesses. A noble's funeral became an opportunity to display piety, lineage, and wealth. Families hired fighters as others might hire mourners. The more lavish the sacrifice, the more glorious the memory of the dead, and the more powerful the living appeared. Anthropologists might call it the socialization of grief, turning loss into theatre so that pain could serve prestige. The early combats were crude. No marble seating, no trumpet calls, just a wooden ring fenced off near the marketplace where animals were traded by morning and men by dusk. The fighters, usually slaves trained hastily for the task, fought with borrowed weapons and a single command to die well. The audience's reaction was uneasy fascination. The Romans believed the dead lingered near their graves for 9 days after burial. To feed them, one poured wine milk or blood into the earth, but here the offering no longer seeped quietly into soil. It moved, screamed, resisted. The historian Tertullian centuries later would sneer that Rome's honour to the dead was the spilling of blood for the sake and satisfaction of the dead. Yet even he admitted that the practice carried something sacred in its origin, a trembling recognition that life and death were not opposites but partners. To kill in mourning was to confess helplessness before fate, to act out the same violence that had taken one's kin, as if by mirroring it one might make sense of it. By the late 3rd century BC, the boundaries of ritual began to blur. Funeral duels drifted into festivals. The munus, once bound to a tomb, became a civic occasion sanctioned by the Senate. Magistrates saw the crowd's hunger and realized that what soothed grief could also command loyalty. In a society ruled by spectacle, blood was currency. Death properly staged could buy affection votes or favor from the gods. The Senate's involvement changed everything. When games were declared public or funded by the state, they ceased to be mere mourning rites and became instruments of control. The Ludi Romani, originally solemn games in honour of Jupiter, absorbed the Monera into their calendar. Senators debated budgets for horses, musicians, and armour with the same seriousness as laws. The line between piety and policy vanished. Some Roman moralists worried even then. Cicero, though, later would write that the games reveal the character of a people. He meant courage and discipline, but others read the phrase differently. The games revealed appetite for blood, for order, for the reassurance that life still obeyed the lash of hierarchy even in death. To sit in the stands was to learn your place in the world, senators under awnings, plebeians in the sun, slaves below the sand. Historians often ask when violence becomes entertainment. The answer in Rome lies in the slow corrosion of meaning. The funeral munus once asked, "What do we owe the dead?" The new spectacles asked, "What will the dead owe us for watching?" The first question was humility, the second dominion. Around this time, a new class of men emerged, lanista trainers and owners of fighters. Their existence signalled the birth of an industry. Grief had been privatized. Now it was professionalized. Schools rose in Capua and Praeneste, where men were taught not merely to die, but to die beautifully. The choreography of death became art. Archaeological finds from Campania show tombs painted with dueling pairs, one fallen, one victorious, both stylized beyond realism. The duel had become iconography. Even the dead wished to be remembered as participants in the ritual they once witnessed. In this way, Rome's earliest arenas were cemeteries twice over filled with bones and with memory. Behind the spectacle lay a logic both chilling and familiar. Every civilization must translate its fear of death into something it can manage. The Egyptians embalmed it, the Greeks philosophized it, the Romans staged it. Each method was a kind of grammar, an attempt to make mortality legible. In turning funerals into performances, Rome was not descending into cruelty, but climbing toward order. It was saying if we can choreograph death, perhaps we can master it. But mastery is a mirage. By absorbing sacrifice into law, Rome ensured that the ritual would never end. Once death served the state, there would always be another corpse to justify another crowd to appease. The Forum Boarium's muddy ground would over centuries give way to marble and blood-stained sand. The wooden barriers would rise into stone amphitheatres. What began as a whisper to the dead would swell into a roar for the living. The Munus born from grief would become the empire's favourite mirror, showing a people not what they lost, but what they had learned to love. And so with that first funeral duel, Rome took its first step toward a civilization that would build theatres for death itself. The blade flashed, the crowd gasped, and a ritual meant to honour the departed quietly began to devour the living. Blood and order. The state discovers the crowd. The Forum's mud hardened into purpose. By the 2nd century BC, wooden arenas began rising across the city like scaffolds of devotion and ambition. What had started as a private ritual of mourning now belonged to the Republic. The Senate, ever watchful of the people's pulse, formalized the Ludi Romani, turning spontaneous funeral rites into scheduled state events. The games were no longer offerings to the dead, they were instruments to stabilize the living. Rome had discovered its most enduring invention, the management of emotion through spectacle. At first, the Senate's sponsorship was justified as piety. The Ludi Romani, held in honor of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, were meant to renew divine favor during times of plague, famine, or political crisis, yet beneath the prayers lay politics. Magistrates, especially the aedles officials charged with organizing public games, saw in these events a ladder of influence. A successful spectacle could buy popularity faster than any law or victory. Blood became a campaign promise, applause the new form of consent. Cicero, writing generations later, admitted the hypocrisy with the eloquence of a man both enthralled and disturbed. The games reveal our courage and discipline, he declared, before confessing that they also reveal our delight in slaughter. Livy too described the expanding scale of such events with a tone caught between reverence and alarm. What began as a family's pious act had grown into the Republic's most seductive tool, a way to remind citizens that Rome could command not just their loyalty but their gaze. Imagine it, the sun blazing on a temporary wooden amphitheatre, its timbers creaking beneath thousands of feet. The air reeked of sweat, pitch and iron. Vendors shouted over the din, selling wine diluted with snow from the Apennines, salted nuts, roasted chickpeas. Senators reclined beneath shaded awnings while plebeians packed the upper benches. Slaves clustered at the edges, straining for a glimpse of what the gods or the powerful might permit them to witness. The social order was mapped onto the seats. The closer one sat to the arena, the closer one was to power. Senators in white togas claimed the front rows, their sandals nearly brushing the sand. Behind them equestrians in fine wool, then the citizens, artisans and freedmen. At the very top in the blazing light stood women foreigners and the poor. Even in leisure hierarchy ruled. The amphitheatre was Rome in miniature. A city inverted its tiers, a census carved in wood. Below in the centre stood the lanista, the trainer and merchant of men. His pupils were no longer mere slaves borrowed for funerals. They were assets trained for endurance and precision. From his compound in Capua came fighters, schooled in technique, the Secutor with his heavy helmet and short sword, the Retiarius with his head and trident agile as a fisherman turned predict. Their duels were rehearsed morality plays, the disciplined against the daring, the armoured against the quick. To the watching crowd, these contests justified the Republic's self-image. Discipline over chaos, order over passion. The state itself is dramatized in blood. When the aedile presiding over the games raised his hand to start the combat, it was not just a signal, it was a declaration that Rome alone could choreograph death without losing control. But control is always a fragile mask. Beneath the civic calm, something darker stirred. As the Republic strained under corruption and civil unrest, the appetite for spectacle grew. The games became distractions, carefully timed opiates for a population weary of politics. The poor, given bread and blood, learned to cheer rather than question. The rich, seated comfortably in shade, mistook their leisure for virtue. By the late Republic, even funerals were excuses for spectacle. Julius Caesar, before his rise, financed extravagant games in honour of his father. Hundreds of fighters imported beasts' music parades. Livy recorded it as a generous offering. Others saw it for what it was, a rehearsal for power. In Rome, death had become advertisement. The philosopher Seneca, who would live centuries later, saw through the illusion. Nothing corrupts the soul like watching another die with pleasure, he warned. Yet his was a voice out of time. In the Republic's fevered century, moral decay was not a flaw, it was a form of governance. To keep the crowd loyal, one had to feed it wonder. And wonder in Rome meant blood made public. The architecture evolved accordingly. Temporary wooden stands gave way to semi-permanent arenas, lined with painted planks. Each festival demanded larger scale, more expense, more bodies. Engineers learned to design seating that funneled sound, 1,000 gasps amplified into one thunderous roar. When the crowd rose to its feet, the tremor felt almost geological. Power had found its echo chamber. Yet amid the cheering, one could sense the inversion. The Republic that preached restraint was building theatres for excess. The society that revered virtue's manly virtue was now defining it through how gracefully one died. Cicero's lament that the games displayed both discipline and delight was prophetic. The moral disease he hinted at was already terminal. The crowd had learned something its rulers could never unteach, that death properly staged was irresistible. What had once been sacred had become civic. What had once been sacrifice had become entertainment. And so as the wooden amphitheatres rose and fell like temporary temples to mortality, Rome itself was learning a new creed. Not, we mourn the dead, but we manage them. The Senate's decrees, the magistrates' ambitions, the people's cheers all fused into a single rhythm, the state discovering that its greatest weapon was not the sword but the spectacle. From this moment forward, politics would be played not only in the forum but in the arena. Every drop of blood spilled in the sand would write another law invisible, but binding that to govern Rome, one must first master its hunger. Man versus beast, the invention of terror as entertainment. The iron gate groaned open. Sunlight cut through the dust, dazzling a figure who stood barefoot on the hot sand. His tunic was torn, his wrists unchained only because there was nowhere left to run. Around him the noise of 50,000 spectators swelled and fractured, cheers, jeers, the rustle of linen, the metallic clatter of anticipation. Somewhere in the tunnels behind him a low growl answered. This was damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, a sentence reserved for criminals, prisoners of war and anyone the state wished to make an example of. It was not battle, it was theatre. Punishment disguised as ceremony, cruelty disguised as order. The man took a step forward. The sand raked smooth by slaves at dawn already shimmered with heat. A horn sounded. Across the arena a second gate rose and a lion emerged, its ribs showing eyes gleaming with the dull brightness of hunger. Rome had learned to weaponize nature itself. The venations or staged hunts began during the late Republic as curiosities. Exotic animals imported from conquered provinces were paraded through the city during triumphs, elephants from Numidia, leopards from Anatolia, crocodiles from Egypt. But soon curiosity turned to spectacle. If Rome could conquer the world, why not make the world perform its submission? General Pompey understood this logic perfectly. In 55 BC, while inaugurating his great stone theatre, he staged games of unprecedented scale. 600 lions, 18 elephants, hundreds of panthers and bears. Pliny the Elder later recorded that the crowd's astonishment drowned out pity. When the elephants were speared and screamed, a sound described as almost human, some spectators wept. But the Senate took note of something else. Those tears too were a kind of applause. The crowd's empathy could be turned into fascination, its horror into loyalty. And so the empire industrialized fear. By the 1st century CE, the bestiarii men trained or forced to fight wild beasts became a distinct class within the gladiatorial order. Some were volunteers seduced by fame or desperation, others were condemned criminals offered a brief chance at survival. Relief carvings show the choreography, the venator poised with spear and shield as a lion lunges, a leopard entangled in a net claws shredding air, a bear driven backward by torches and dogs. Every movement was both ritual and improvisation, a conversation between man and hunger. The logistics of terror were vast. Rome imported tens of thousands of animals each year from Africa and Asia. Armies of trappers, sailors and traders turned the empire's frontiers into hunting grounds. Giraffes from Nubia, tigers from India, even hippos from the Nile Delta were dragged across continents to feed the city's appetite. Ecological traces remain entire species vanished from North Africa within a century of the game's peak. The Colosseum's blood was the colour of extinction. Seneca, writing from the shaded calm of his study, recoiled from what he saw. In his letters to Lucilius, he confessed that attending the midday executions left him more cruel, more inhuman. The crowd, he said, demanded novelty. They were no longer content with duels or beasts, they wanted improvisation, then spectacle without script. Men were forced to reenact myths to die inventively. There is nothing so deadly, Seneca wrote, as the leisure of the masses. Yet his protest changed nothing. The damnatio ad bestias remained the empire's favourite theatre of punishment. For the condemned there was no suspense, only certainty. They were led into the arena with music garlands and mockery. Sometimes dressed as mythological figures, sometimes naked. A slave might be cast as Orpheus, taming the beasts with song, until the animals prodded to fury tore him apart. The animals themselves were tools of narrative. Trainers starved them for days, pricked them with spears, or smeared their cages with the blood of previous victims. Their hunger was scripted. Every roar was rehearsed. The audience's silence the moment before attack was part of the choreography. Terror, like any art, required timing. When the lion finally sprang, time fractured. The sound that followed bones breaking under muscle was the empire's own music. The crowd rose, an organism made of noise. Somewhere above, the presiding magistrate watched calmly, knowing that this horror would earn him admiration. Rome had achieved a terrible perfection, violence, so disciplined it felt divine. Archaeology preserves what pity could not. In Roman Britain, the pelvis of a young man was found scarred by deep bite marks matching the jaw of a large feline. Analysis showed he was likely a trained gladiator, not a criminal. His bones told the story his name could not. He faced the beast was mauled and left as an offering to spectacle. Across the empire, similar remains whisper the same truth, that terror was not an accident but an institution. The Venaciones were more than execution. They were empire condensed. Each animal paraded into the arena symbolized a conquered land. The leopard from Numidia, the rhinoceros from Ethiopia, the tiger from Parthia, all trophies made flesh. Their deaths affirmed the geography of domination. Nature itself seemed to kneel before Rome, but every empire leaves its mirror. What the Romans applauded as triumph we recognize as rehearsal. The fascination with orchestrated danger did not die with the amphitheatres. It resurfaced in bullfights, in public hangings, in the flickering glow of modern screens, where violence is still consumed safely behind glass. The crowd has not vanished, it has merely changed its seating. Psychologists might say the arena satisfied something primitive, a need to witness fear without sharing it, to flirt with mortality from the safety of distance. In that sense, the Colosseum was not unique. It was humanity's first laboratory for empathy's collapse. The Romans only built the walls, we still supply the audience. In the end, the condemned man's body lay silent. The lion crouched beside him, panting. Slaves rushed forward to drag away what remained, while musicians struck up a triumphant tune. The crowd exhaled. Bread was thrown from the upper tiers. The emperor's name was chanted. The sand was raked clean, as if the blood had been only a stain on memory. The next gate would open soon. Another man, another roar. Another reminder that Rome's true genius was not conquest, it was choreography. It had learned to turn terror into rhythm, death into order, and cruelty into applause. The ocean in chains, now Machaea. Rome's water wars. The water was perfectly still, an expanse of silver under the Roman sun, bordered by marble and banners. At first there was silence save for the fluttering of fabric in the wind. Then a horn blared. Drums thundered from opposite sides of the basin, echoing through the valley like heartbeat and war cry in one. Oars struck the surface in unison and the calm lake exploded into motion. It was 46 BC. Julius Caesar, having conquered Gaul and outlived Pompey, now sought to conquer imagination itself. Near the Tiber, he had ordered a vast artificial lake dug, fed by diverted channels, to host what Rome had never seen before, a naval battle fought not in the sea, but within the city's reach. Wooden triremes clashed across man-made waters rowed by thousands of men condemned to die. They wore the armour of Tyrians and Egyptians, reenacting a mythic war between nations long conquered, long silenced. Caesar's Naumachia was not entertainment. It was ideology, a demonstration that Rome could summon the ocean at will. In a city built on dust, he created tide and foam as if Neptune himself had been pressed into civic service. The chronicler Suetonius described the spectacle with awe: real ships, real catapults, real blood. Every stroke of an oar was a drumbeat of submission. Caesar had done what no mortal should he had chained the sea. The audience watched from wooden bleachers and temporary stands 1,000 strong. Senators reclined on embroidered cushions, while plebeians leaned over railings slick with spray. From afar it must have looked divine sunlight catching the bronze rams of ships as they collided, shields flashing like fish scales, the rhythmic rise and fall of sails that would soon be shredded by fire. Trumpets called, oars thrashed, and the lake became a mirror of empire-ordered chaos, beautiful and lethal. 2 generations later, Augustus turned that fleeting vision into infrastructure. In 2 BC, he commissioned an immense basin Naumachia Augusti measuring nearly 1,800 by 1,200 Roman feet, large enough to hold 30 fully armed warships. To fill it, he built a new aqueduct, the Aqua Alsietina, drawing water from Lake Alsietinus miles away. Rome's engineers, masters of stone and gradient, carved channels through hills and valleys, timing the flow so precisely that the lake could be filled or drained within days. No project better captured the empire's creed imperium sine fine power without limit, not even over nature. At the inauguration, Augustus staged a battle of 3,000 men. They fought with the desperation of those who knew the water was their grave. Pliny the Elder later wrote that the lake seemed alive, waves whipped by wind, the crash of hull against hull reverberating through marble embankments, the screams of the dying drowned by cheers. The emperor watched from a raised platform, calm as a god above the storm. Rome had learned to choreograph the sea. In 52 AD, Emperor E. Claudius outdid them all. He ordered a Naumachia on Lake Fucine, not in a man-made basin, but upon an actual mountain lake. To drain it, he commanded the construction of a 3-mile tunnel through solid rock, a task that consumed 11 years and 30,000 labourers. When the waters finally lowered enough for battle, Claudius filled the surface with ships and fighters. As the emperor and his entourage watched from gilded pavilions, the condemned greeted him with words that would outlive them all: Ave Imperator morituri te salutant. Hail Emperor, those who are about to die salute you. Whether spontaneous or rehearsed, the phrase became the empire's epitaph. It was not rebellion, it was ritual acceptance, the human voice submitting to spectacle. The crowd roared approval, the signal was given, and the ships rammed each other until the water turned red. Claudius, ever pedantic, ordered the survivors to continue until every man had died as planned. Even victory in Rome required obedience. Centuries later, under Trajan, the tradition endured. He constructed another monumental basin near the Vatican Hill, the Naumachia, Naumachia Vaticana, capable of seating tens of thousands. By then, these aquatic dramas had become less about myth and more about control. The empire's citizens watched as the state made the impossible routine. Oceans moved lakes, drained men killed on cue. The mechanics were staggering. Thousands of engineers and slaves laboured behind the scenes to manage the waterworks' valves, sluices, and drains hidden beneath stone. The logistics of the Naumachia were as complex as any campaign. Shipwrights crafted vessels not for voyage, but for theatre hulls built light enough to sink at command, yet ornate enough to please the eye before doing so. Painted gods adorned the prows, soon to vanish beneath waves. The choreography of drowning was itself a form of art. To hear the games described by poets like Martial is to sense awe mixed with dread. The sea itself obeyed, he wrote of Titus's inaugural shows, and indeed it did. To the Romans, these spectacles were not madness, but proof of dominion that the world land beast and now water had been conquered, disciplined, domesticated. The emperor's control of the elements reflected his control of life. The drums of the Naumachia did not merely echo across the water they carried through time. They were the ancestors of the national parade, the coronation, the military flyover. Every modern state that choreographs power in sound and colour inherits a fragment of that Roman rhythm. When we watch armies march in perfect step or fireworks burst above monuments, we are glimpsing the same instinct to turn domination into choreography, politics into awe, but the grandeur came at a cost. Each Naumachia consumed life's animals' resources. Rivers were diverted, lakes despoiled, forests felled for a single afternoon's wonder. The empire's mastery over nature was in truth its exhaustion of it. The drained lakes and dead men became the invisible foundation of imperial pride. When the last bodies sank beneath Claudius's lake, the water slowly closed, rippling back to stillness, as if nothing had happened. The emperor turned away, satisfied. The audience dispersed their sandals, splashing in the puddles left behind. For a moment, Rome's heart reflected itself calm on the surface, violent underneath. In the Naumachia, the empire found its ultimate metaphor, a civilization that commanded the sea but never its own thirst. Myth made flesh the theatrical executions. By the year AD 80, the Colosseum was new, its marble still white, its arches still breathing the scent of wet lime and incense. Tens of thousands of Romans filled its seats, murmuring beneath the bright noon sun. The morning's gladiator matches had ended in blood and cheers. Now came the meridiani, the midday interval. But there was no rest. The crowd demanded something different, something stranger. It began as always with the myth. The gates opened to reveal a man in a musician's robe carrying a lyre. He walked to the centre of the sand, bowed, and began to sing. His name was not Orpheus, but that was the part he played. Around him, stagehands disguised as forest spirits released animals, tame leopards, birds, even a bear. The crowd laughed. The performer smiled nervously, strumming his lyre. Then on cue the music stopped. The handlers withdrew and the tame creatures were replaced by others, starved. Agitated, their claws scraped against the iron gates until sparks flew. The bear lunged first. The man screamed, stumbled and vanished beneath the weight of myth. The poet Martial, an eyewitness to the inaugural games under Titus, recorded the scene with detached admiration. Orpheus was there, but beasts knew not his song. The Colosseum had transformed legend into execution. The myth had been inverted, art silenced, beauty devoured. To the Roman audience this was not blasphemy, it was affirmation. The gods themselves were actors in Rome's moral theatre, their sufferings repurposed to remind mortals of divine order. The condemned were merely vessels' bodies through which the empire retold the universe on its own terms. The line between ritual and cruelty dissolved, and what remained was a new religion spectacle. Soon came Daedalus. A wooden frame resembling wings was lowered into the arena. The condemned strapped to it was hoisted into the air. For a brief moment he floated, flapping the crude feathers as the crowd gasped in delight. Then the mechanism failed as designed. He fell screaming and the wings caught fire before he struck the ground. Martial wrote of it with irony sharp enough to cut through time. How you must wish you had your feathers now. There was no moral lesson in the ashes, only applause. Other reenactments were darker still. One of the most infamous was the story of Pasiphae, the Cretan queen, cursed to lust after a bull. In myth, her punishment was humiliation. In Rome, it was recreated as reality. The crowd roared as an actor, perhaps a woman, perhaps a condemned man in disguise, was placed within a wooden model of a cow. When the beast was driven forth, the line between punishment and pornography disappeared entirely. Tertullian, writing a century later with bitter precision, condemned it as the theatre of damnation. He spoke for those who could no longer pretend that ritual masked cruelty. Other victims were forced to wear the tunica molesta, a pitch-soaked garment set up ablaze to represent the self-sacrifice of mythic heroes like Mucius Scaevola, who burned his own hand in loyalty to Rome. But this time there was no heroism, only heat and screams. The crowd called it piety, the victims called it silence. To modernize such spectacles seem unfathomable, but to Rome they were moral instruction wrapped in horror. Myths were not fictions, they were frameworks for justice. Every death reenacted divine balance. When Orpheus died, it was art failing to master nature. When Daedalus fell, it was ambition punished. When Pasiphae suffered, it was lust exposed. Rome's cruelty always wore the mask of philosophy. Anthropologists might call this a form of scapegoating ritual, a practice as old as civilization itself. Ancient peoples had long purged their collective guilt by transferring it to a chosen victim, then destroying that victim in ceremony. In the Colosseum, this instinct reached industrial perfection. The empire could not cleanse its sins of conquest and power, but it could disguise them as morality plays. Blood became absolution. The theatre itself encouraged this illusion. Its staging was meticulous, its machinery miraculous. Platforms rose from beneath the floor. Trapdoors released actors into mythic landscapes painted with coloured sand and petals. The audience was suspended between belief and complicity. They were both witnesses and participants, their approval sanctifying what they saw. The line between religion, art and cruelty had not just blurred, it had fused. Even philosophers who despised the games recognized their terrible beauty. Seneca, years before the Colosseum's completion, had already sensed the sickness taking root. I come home more greedy, more ambitious, more inhuman, for I have been among men. He knew what the arena did to its audience. It transformed empathy into rhythm, pity into applause. The Romans, for all their sophistication, never saw the contradiction. They believed that to reenact myth was to reaffirm their bond with the gods, yet in doing so they inverted the sacred. The stories meant to remind humans of divine frailty were turned into proofs of divine cruelty. It was not Zeus or Venus who demanded blood, it was the empire cloaked in divine pretense. The Colosseum thus became a temple of control. Every execution was an act of theology written in muscle and flame. The emperor presiding from his gilded box was both priest and playwright. When he gave the signal for death, he was imitating Jupiter's thunderbolt, the human hand elevated to divine authority. And the crowd believed. They cheered not for vengeance, but for order restored. The myths comforted them because they suggested meaning behind the suffering, purpose behind the pain. In that illusion lay Rome's genius to make barbarity feel sacred, to turn death into reassurance. When the final victim of the day collapsed in the sand, smoke rising from what remained of the tunica molesta, the crowd exhaled as one. Incense was burned. Musicians played hymns. From a distance it could have been mistaken for a religious ceremony, and perhaps it was. The gods had spoken through screams. In the shadow of those marble tears, the boundary between faith and fear vanished. The empire's stories were no longer told in words or marble, but in flesh. And the Colosseum, radiant in sunlight, was not just a monument to power. It was a mirror of belief, reflecting how easily reverence can become cruelty when a civilization decides that the divine requires witnesses. The politics of pain, emperors, and the spectacle state. By the time Augustus claimed the empire, Rome had already learned that its people could be ruled not just by laws or armies, but by rhythm, the recurring pulse of spectacle. The emperor inherited a republic weary of blood and debt, and he soothed it with something more potent than peace distraction. Panem et circenses, bread and circuses. It was Juvenal's later phrase, but Augustus was the one who perfected it. He fed the belly and the eye together, and in that union he found the formula for eternity. The Colosseum, when it rose a century later under the Flavians, was the visible monument of that equation, a gift from rulers who understood that generosity could be the gentlest form of tyranny. Every seat, every coin spent on marble and awnings proclaimed imperial benevolence. The message was simple: you suffer, but your emperor provides. Behind this architecture of gratitude lay a hidden economy, the economics of blood. Gladiators had become investments. Vast training schools or ludi sprawled outside the city walls, their cells echoing with the clang of practice swords. The Ludus Magnus, the largest of them, stood within sight of the Colosseum. At dawn, recruits drilled in sand, darkened by generations of sweat. They learned to die well, the slow pivot, the theatrical collapse, the final salute. Each fighter was catalogued, insured, and taxed. A skilled secutor could be worth more than a merchant's house. Funding the games required empire-wide logistics. Provinces sent animals weapons and human tributes as taxes in kind. Egypt supplied lions, Numidia ostriches, Spain bulls. The governors who organised the shipments knew that their careers depended on spectacle as much as justice. A single botched delivery could doom a politician. The empire's arteries carried not only grain and gold, but terror feeding the great heart of the capital. The emperors understood the exchange perfectly. Cruelty could be camouflaged as generosity, oppression wrapped in gratitude. To fund the games was to erase memory of taxation. To spill blood in the arena was to cleanse the empire's conscience. Nero, ever the performer, blurred the line between artist and autocrat. His games began at sunset and ended at dawn. He illuminated the night with torches made of men, Christians and criminals bound to stakes, their pitch-soaked bodies ignited to light the gardens. He called it innovation. The crowd called it entertainment. Rome learned to applaud even the darkness so long as it flickered beautifully. Domitian followed with subtler brutality. His reign perfected precision hunts staged at night under moonlight dwarfs, and women forced to fight as curiosities, mythological executions rehearsed to the rhythm of music. He introduced aquatic creatures into the arena, sea beasts hauled inland just to demonstrate that no environment lay beyond his reach. His cruelty was administrative, not impulsive. He ruled through choreography, through the illusion of cosmic order, emperor, as gods subjects as instruments. And then came Trajan the Conqueror, who turned mercy itself into propaganda. In AD 107, celebrating his victories in Dacia, he hosted the longest games Rome had ever seen, 123 days of combat, 11,000 gladiators, 10,000 animals slain. It was excess elevated to policy. Cassius Dio records the scale with weary admiration, as though describing an empire feasting on its own reflection. The Colosseum became not merely a stage, it became the empire's beating heart timed to the emperor's will. Every drop of blood spilled was a public signature of loyalty. The audience did not question who paid for it. They knew. The games were personal gifts, gestures of gratitude from emperor to people binding ruler, and ruled in a cycle of dependency. The citizen received food spectacle and a fleeting sense of belonging. The emperor received silence. The amphitheatre's walls carried the residue of that exchange. Graffiti scratched by spectators, survived names of favourite fighters, crude depictions of victories, even prayers for more blood. In Pompeii, one inscription boasts 20 pairs fought. None fled. It was civic pride rendered in gore. Mosaics from North Africa show similar reverence. A gladiator's helmet rendered in tesserae of gold lions mid-pounce, each image a small hymn to Rome's perfection through violence. The propaganda worked because it disguised its mechanism as mercy. The emperor did not kill, he pardoned. Condemned fighters who fought bravely might be granted life. The gesture seemed divine. The crowd's cry of "Mite, spare him," was the empire's favourite illusion of compassion, a ritual that made subjects feel powerful while reminding them that only one man could truly decide. To watch from the stands was to participate in the empire's theology of control. Each tier of seating was a sermon in stone, the emperor enthroned at the centre like a sun. Senators closest to the sand, citizens rising in concentric order, slaves and women at the heights, every eye faced inward, every breath drawn toward one focal point, authority embodied in blood. The amphitheatre was not just an arena, it was an empire turned inside out. Archaeologists examining the Colosseum's substructures speak of its brilliance, elevators, pulleys, trapdoors, all engineered for fluid spectacle. But what made it truly magnificent was not its mechanics, but its meaning. The empire had learned how to make cruelty feel organised, even sacred. Pain had become a form of administration. When Marshall described the games, he called them munera gifts. The word persisted because it concealed the truth. These were not gifts, they were contracts between ruler and ruled, between terror and gratitude. Each show reinforced the belief that power was generosity, that tyranny could be beautiful so long as it glittered. And the crowd believed. They returned day after day, generation after generation, to the marble bowl that promised belonging through blood. They carved names, wrote poems, and passed down memories of their favourite duels. Pain became heritage. The empire's cruelty was no longer questioned. It was collected, curated, celebrated. When the emperor waved his hand to signal death, he did not merely kill a man. He reminded millions that mercy flowed only downward, that even kindness could be a form of command. In the end, the Colosseum was less a monument to brutality than to obedience. Its true architecture was psychological. Every roar, every cheer, every gasp calibrated to teach a single lesson that Rome's power was eternal because Rome's people had learned to love their own submission. The fiancés, philosophers, and the conscience of Rome. By the 1st century, the Colosseum had become Rome's beating heart and its unquiet conscience. Every day began with ceremony and ended with applause. Yet beneath the rhythm of the drums there stirred another sound, a question that even empire could not drown. How could a civilization that revered law, order, and virtue take such joy in torment? The first to whisper doubt were not rebels but philosophers. Stoics, moralists, and men of letters who had drunk deeply from Rome's ideals began to sense a fracture in the marble of their world. Among them was Seneca, tutor to Nero, statesman, playwright, and reluctant witness to his own age's appetite for blood. In his letters to Lucilius, he confessed that the games had poisoned him. "When I leave the amphitheatre," he wrote, "I am more greedy, more ambitious, more cruel and inhuman because I have been among men." He described the midday executions, the Meridiani, when condemned prisoners were slaughtered between gladiatorial shows to amuse a restless crowd. There is no spectacle, he lamented, so ruinous to good character as the sight of suffering. To Seneca, the arena was not a mirror of Rome's greatness, but of its sickness, a contagion that began in the eyes and spread to the soul. Cicero, though earlier, by a century, had already anticipated this decay. In his defence of public virtue, he warned that the games reveal the character of a people. What he saw in the growing hunger for spectacle terrified him, a republic that had forgotten the meaning of humanitas, the humane spirit. To him, the sight of thousands cheering at death signalled the erosion of what once made Rome noble. When blood became entertainment, he feared the republic's heart had already stopped beating. Yet even as philosophers wrote, the crowd roared louder. The empire was too vast, too hungry, too certain of itself to be swayed by conscience. The Stoics spoke of self-discipline of the logos, the rational spark uniting all humans under nature's law. But in the Colosseum reason was drowned by ritual. The arena reversed the Stoic ideal. Men sought to master their passions by indulging them to find virtue in cruelty measured by precision. Still the cracks widened. In the private writings of moralists, the tone shifted from admiration to shame. Plutarch scolded those who confused courage with savagery. Epictetus, a slave-turned-philosopher, warned his students that when you applaud the gladiator, you are already conquered. These men were not revolutionaries, but witnesses trying to reclaim the moral vocabulary the empire had stolen. Their resistance was philosophical, not political, but it mattered. The Stoics had taught that true strength lay in endurance without hatred, in suffering born with dignity. And in that teaching unintended seeds were planted. Centuries later, Christianity would take root in that same soil of endurance, transforming passive suffering into moral triumph. What the philosophers meant as withdrawal from cruelty became in Christian hands the logic of martyrdom. Tertullian, one of the earliest Christian voices to confront Rome's spectacles, turned Seneca's lament into condemnation. What you worship, he wrote to the pagans, is cruelty disguised as devotion. He described the tunica molesta, the burning garment, and the mock reenactments of myths with horror. We are mocked as kindling men, he wrote bitterly, recounting how believers were burned alive as though playing parts in divine theatre. For him, the games were not a reflection of the gods, they were the proof that Rome had none. The philosophical and the spiritual began to converge. Seneca's plea for rational compassion met the Christian belief in sacred suffering, and together they forged a new moral language: pity as strength, mercy as resistance. Where the arena taught that pain could be purified through spectacle, the new ethic insisted that pain could be redeemed only through empathy. But such transformation came slowly. For most Romans, virtue remained a public act, and mercy was a privilege, not a duty. The Stoic philosopher Musonius Rufus, teaching during Nero's reign, told his students that to take delight in another's pain is to confess one's own slavery. His words were dangerous not politically but spiritually. To call the spectator enslaved was to invert the entire order of the empire. Freedom, he implied, did not belong to those who commanded death, but to those who refused to enjoy it. Even the architecture of the amphitheatre began to trouble thoughtful observers. Its perfect geometry, its harmony of stone and crowd revealed something unsettling, that evil could be orderly, even beautiful. The Colosseum's very symmetry mirrored the empire's self-image discipline, masking domination, balance, concealing cruelty. The Stoics who preached harmony with nature could not ignore the irony of harmony built on suffering. As early Christianity spread through Rome's alleys and tenements, its followers inherited this philosophical unease. The arena, once a symbol of civic virtue, became a stage for a different drama defiance through endurance. When Christians were thrown to beasts, they did not plead for life. They prayed, sang, and forgave. The crowd, expecting fear, witnessed serenity, and something in the Roman mind shifted. Martyrdom turned the empire's ritual of domination into a theatre of conscience. The transformation was not immediate, but it was irreversible. The Stoic idea of inner freedom merged with the Christian vision of moral truth. Slowly, the empire that had mastered the art of death began to fear the quiet strength of those who no longer feared dying. Seneca's lament, once a personal confession, became prophecy. Violence had indeed mirrored itself back into the soul of Rome. What began as entertainment had become a kind of haunting. Every scream the city applauded echoed inward, eroding certainty, until even emperors sought justification for their mercy. By the 2nd century, Rome's philosophers no longer spoke only of law or reason. They spoke of pietas, duty touched by compassion. They understood that a civilization capable of engineering perfect death must also engineer its own salvation. The Colosseum still thundered with applause, but now scattered among the cheers, there were moments of silence, hesitations perhaps, or the faint beginning of shame. In that silence, the conscience of Rome began to breathe. The mirror of civilization. Legacy and lessons. The roar of the Colosseum has long since faded, yet it lingers in echoes in architecture in us. The marble has cracked, the sand has turned to dust and grass, now grows where emperors once sat enthroned. But if you listen closely when the wind passes through the arches, it still sounds like applause. Rome's arenas did not die with the empire. They multiplied, changed shape, and found new languages. The medieval square where heretics were burned before an audience of thousands. The scaffold where public hangings became sermons in flesh. The bullring where bravery and cruelty learned to dance. Even the quiet hum of modern screens, each one carries the same DNA. Civilization never abandoned spectacle. It simply refined its lighting. After Rome, kings and nations learned that control need not come from decree, it could come from attention. What the Senate once achieved with amphitheatres, later rulers achieved with processions, carnivals, executions. When the guillotine rose in Paris, it was called the national razor, and citizens attended as if to theatre. When conquistadors staged ritual killings before New World crowds, they invoked God instead of Jupiter, but the logic was identical terror, as pedagogy blood as pedagogy order renewed through display. Even the church, which once condemned the games, absorbed their rhythm. Processions, relics, martyr plays all took on the structure of spectacle, transforming pain into liturgy. Humanity's hunger for visible meaning proved stronger than any reform. In every century the stage changed, but the contract remained. Someone suffers, others watch, and society tells itself that meaning lies somewhere between. Today the amphitheatre is digital, the arena invisible. We no longer sit on marble but on couches, and yet we still watch wars, televised tragedies, replayed humiliation edited into entertainment. Our cruelty is cleaner, our applause silent. But the impulse is the same, to feel safe by observing, the unsafe to mistake witnessing for understanding. Rome's lesson is not that we have outgrown violence, but that we have learned to aestheticize it. The empire mastered the choreography of obedience, teaching its citizens to equate cruelty with culture, spectacle with stability. That machinery survives wherever power hides behind beauty, wherever suffering becomes content. And yet across the centuries another inheritance endures conscience. The same voice that spoke through Seneca's weariness and Tertullian's rage whispers still that empathy is not weakness, that civilization's greatness lies not in the structures it raises, but in the boundaries it refuses to cross. The ruins of the Colosseum are more than relics. They are mirrors. Tourists wander its corridors, taking photographs where slaves once waited for death. Some pause uneasy as if aware that the stones remember. Others stand in silence, imagining the roar that once filled the air. It is not condemnation they feel, but recognition. Because every society builds its own arena, and every generation must decide what it will allow to unfold there. If the Romans once believed that death could be purified through ritual, we risk believing that it can be neutralized through distance. The danger is not that we are cruel, but that we are comfortable. When the philosopher Boethius, writing centuries after the last games, looked back on Rome, he called its grandeur the glitter of a corpse. He understood that empires do not fall when they lose wars, they fall when they lose empathy. The Colosseum was not merely an architectural wonder, it was a confession carved in stone of how easily glory feeds on silence. So what remains for us to learn from the sand and shadow that power always seeks an audience? That obedience is sweetest when disguised as pleasure. That the true test of civilization lies not in what it builds, but in what it permits itself to watch. As the sun sets over the ruins, the wind moves softly through the arches. The sound is not applause anymore. It is breath, the breath of memory, of ghosts of lessons still waiting to be heard. And in that hush, after 2,000 years, Rome speaks its final truth. Every empire begins with vision and ends with spectators. Thanks for being here. Hit that subscribe button and join us for the next chapters full of history and discovery.